I remember the night I first opened the Gilbert file. Even after decades in the field, the kind of case that makes your pulse tighten is rare, yet the folder in my hand felt heavier than its weight suggested. It had the unmistakable aura of a story where too many things had gone wrong and too many people had looked away at the wrong moment. A story that begins not with blood on the floor, but with a whisper on the phone. A whisper from a woman who knew something terrible was about to happen to her. The call came in at 4:51 in the morning on May 1st, 2010. The dispatcher's log described a young woman sounding terrified while running through a residential neighborhood near the shoreline of Long Island. Her name was Shannan Gilbert. 22 minutes of recorded fear. 22 minutes that would reshape not just her story, but the story of Long Island itself. If you listen carefully to that audio, you do not hear confusion. You do not hear hallucination. What you hear is a woman in a state of pure survival. I have listened to hundreds of emergency calls, and there is a line that separates panic from delusion. Shannan's voice was firmly on the side of clarity. She was afraid of someone, and every fiber in her body was telling her she was in danger. Oak Beach is an isolated waterfront community cut away from the pulse of the rest of Long Island. It is the kind of neighborhood that speaks in quiet codes. People know one another. They protect one another. Outsiders slip into the shadows quickly. On that morning, Shannan moved between those houses like a ghost who desperately wanted to be seen. She knocked on doors. She begged for help. Some residents later said they saw her. Some said they heard her. None of them gave her shelter. None of them called for help fast enough. That is the part that never stops bothering me. A woman running for her life in a place that prides itself on safety, yet she vanished before dawn without anyone lifting a finger to save her. Either no one understood the danger, or someone understood it too well. The last sighting placed her near the marshland. The tide was low. The reeds were tall enough to swallow a person whole. The dispatcher stayed on the line while Shannan's voice drifted between breathless fear and broken fragments. Then the line went silent, and the world went silent with her. 18 months passed before her remains were found. During those 18 months, the search for Shannan uncovered 10 other bodies along Ocean Parkway. 10 victims whose disappearances formed the shadow of a killer the world would soon call the Long Island serial killer. If Shannan had not disappeared, those bodies might have remained hidden for years. Her death became the catalyst of an investigation far larger than her own tragedy. The official theory claimed she died by accident. The marsh was to blame, they said. Hypothermia, they said. Disorientation, they said. But none of those explanations addressed the questions that mattered. Why did she run? Why did she say they were trying to kill her? Why did no one in Oak Beach intervene in time? Why did her belongings end up far from where her body was found? Why did the night swallow her so completely? The deeper I read, the thicker the fog became. Her last known contacts each held pieces of the puzzle that did not quite fit together. The client who hired her insisted she panicked for no reason. Her driver claimed he was trying to help her. Neighbors claimed they were confused by what was happening. Everyone had an answer, but none had the truth. The story of that night is more than a disappearance. It is a collision of fear, power, secrecy, and silence. It is a story that begins with a phone call but refuses to end neatly even after all these years. And as I stood over the first pages of the file, I understood that this case would demand more of me than usual because Shannan had tried to save herself. She had tried to speak. She had tried to run. She had tried to survive. Society simply did not listen. But I will listen. I will tell this story exactly as it deserves to be told. Not with certainty, but with relentless pursuit. The night the silence broke was the night the truth began pushing its way to the surface. And this is where our investigation begins. When you investigate a disappearance, you usually begin with the same set of principles that have guided detectives for generations. Start with the timeline, identify the witnesses, pinpoint the environment, establish who saw what and when. But Oak Beach was not the kind of place that allowed itself to be mapped with simple lines and simple logic. The deeper I stepped into Shannan Gilbert's final hours, the more I sensed that this community did not merely serve as the backdrop to a tragedy. It was a character of its own, shaped by secrets that had been fermenting long before Shannan ran into the night. I drove into Oak Beach for the first time on a foggy afternoon. The road twisted along the edge of the water until the houses rose up ahead of me in a tight cluster of quiet privilege. The air carried the scent of salt and old wood mixed with something heavier. The kind of quiet that is not peaceful but guarded. The people who lived there had built a world that stood slightly apart from the rest of Long Island, like an island within an island. They wanted control. They wanted privacy. And on the night of Shannan's disappearance, they had both. The first accounts came from residents who claimed they heard commotion outside around dawn. Some said they heard footsteps running. Some said a woman was crying for help. A few said they saw a dark figure moving quickly between the houses. But when I spoke to them individually, the clarity of their memories seemed to dissolve. One resident insisted he did not see anything until the police arrived. Another said he saw Shannan, but she appeared confused, so he did not approach her. A third said he heard her voice, but thought it was part of an argument happening inside another house. The lack of urgency baffled me. Human instinct should compel someone to react when they hear a plea for help in the dead of night. Yet in Oak Beach, instinct seemed to bend towards self-preservation. People there watched from windows. They listened from behind doors. They observed but did not intervene. Something about that silence felt deliberate. The more I questioned them, the more I realized that each person knew how the others would respond. Oak Beach was a place where reputations mattered, where outsiders were tolerated only as long as they did not disturb the equilibrium. Shannan was an outsider, and on the night she needed help the most, she was treated like a disturbance in the system, something that needed to move along and disappear. I reconstructed her path through the neighborhood as best as possible. Witnesses said she ran from one house to another with no coherent pattern. She was barefoot. She was panicked. She knocked on at least 2 doors that we could confirm, but possibly more. She reached the home of a man who would later become a puzzle piece of significant weight in this investigation. A man whose presence in the community seemed to influence the responses of those around him. His name would appear repeatedly in the file like a shadow that refused to stay in the background. That man was Dr. Charles Hackett. I remember the moment his name first crossed my desk. A local physician with a reputation for being eccentric. A man who enjoyed hosting parties. A man who seemed overly interested in the details of the search effort. A man who sent messages to Shannan's mother for reasons he could never quite articulate. Some residents described him as helpful. Others described him as unsettling. The contradiction alone was enough to raise a flag. The official account from Hackett was that he had minimal contact with Shannan. He claimed he did not remember much. He said she came near his property, but he did not engage with her. But this version of events never aligned with the way others described that night. There was always something oddly practiced about his tone, as if he had recited his explanation many times. When I interviewed him, he smiled too often. His eyes flicked between my notepad and the window, as though calculating the safest possible version of himself to present. But a smile can be a shield, and shields usually mean someone has something to protect. Before Hackett can be fully examined, we need to understand the layout of Oak Beach itself. The streets form a loop that narrows as you move deeper into the neighborhood. Houses sit close together, creating natural corridors of movement. Anyone running through those lanes at night would be seen by multiple homes, which means multiple people saw Shannan or heard her or sensed her presence. Yet the story they provided afterward was curiously fragmented, as if they each held a piece of a picture they refused to assemble. Shannan's path eventually drew her toward the marshland. That detail has never stopped haunting me. Marshes are places where noise dies quickly, places where light fades before it reaches the ground. They are nature's erasers. If you want to disappear something without leaving a trace, the marsh will help you. I stood at that edge on a windy afternoon and imagined her running into the darkness. I imagined the sound of reeds scraping against her legs. I imagined the cold mud swallowing her steps. I imagined her turning back to look for someone, anyone who might still be willing to help. And I imagined nothing answering her except the wind. A community like Oak Beach does not create a tragedy, but it can shape one. Its silence becomes a wall. Its hesitation becomes a trap. Its refusal to act becomes part of the crime, even if no one there ever lays a hand on the victim. By the time I finished interviewing the last resident, I realized that what happened to Shannan was not just the story of a woman in danger. It was the story of a neighborhood that turned its back at the exact moment she needed humanity the most. In any disappearance, there is always a moment when the victim still has a chance to survive. In this case, that moment passed while dozens of people stood inside their warm homes pretending not to hear. The question that haunted me afterward was simple. Did they stay silent because they did not understand the danger, or did they stay silent because someone in Oak Beach wanted the night to swallow her without witnesses? That question became the thread that would guide the rest of this investigation. And as I pulled on it, the fabric around the community began to unravel, revealing layers of fear, influence, and hidden alliances that hinted at a darker truth beneath the surface. The marsh does not care about the living. It does not care about fear or desperation or the final footsteps of someone trying to survive the night. The marsh consumes. It erases. It folds time in on itself until the truth becomes something soft and difficult to grasp. When I walked into that landscape searching for the final moments of Shannan Gilbert, I understood immediately why this place had held its secrets for 18 months. Ocean Parkway stretched behind me like a spine of asphalt, while the wet earth ahead shifted under every step. The reeds were taller than my shoulders and swayed with a rhythm that felt ancient. The air buzzed with insects and something else that felt older than insects. A heaviness that pressed in on the senses. Standing there, I could not help but imagine Shannan moving through the same darkness barefoot and terrified, with only the faintest hope that someone would hear her before the marsh swallowed her voice. I knelt at the site where her remains were eventually found. The investigators who first arrived here described the scene as scattered and unnatural. Clothing in one place, a phone in another, a purse far from both, and bones dispersed as though the marsh itself had unfolded her into pieces. But nature rarely creates patterns that look purposeful. When something appears arranged even slightly, the possibility of human involvement always rises to the surface. The official explanation claimed that animals had carried her remains. But the marsh is not a forest filled with predators. It is a wetland. It has its scavengers, of course, but the level of displacement around her site suggested movement before decomposition. A movement that would have required intent. I closed my eyes and tried to reconstruct the night. I pictured Shannan leaving the final cluster of houses in Oak Beach. I pictured her running into the open and the earth turning soft beneath her feet. I pictured her looking back toward the lights of the neighborhood and realizing those lights were not coming for her. Then I pictured the moment she stepped into the marsh. A moment where the world behind her had failed her, and the world ahead offered no path. In many cases involving missing persons, the landscape becomes a secondary suspect. And in this investigation, the marsh was both a suspect and a witness. It concealed evidence, yet it preserved just enough to keep questions alive. Her jawbone told a story that did not match the official account. Fractured in a way that raised the eyebrows of Dr. Michael Barden, the forensic expert brought in by the family. Injuries like that can come from many sources, but the more I stared at the photos, the more unconvinced I became that simple environmental pressure caused it. I thought of the people who last saw her. The client, Joseph Brewer, who insisted she panicked without reason. The driver, Michael Pack, who said he tried to help her only for her to run from him as if he were the danger she feared. And the physician, Charles Hackett, whose presence lingered in the background of every timeline. 3 men who became central to her final hours, each surrounded by their own contradictions. If Shannan entered the marsh on her own, what kept her from returning to the solid ground behind her? The area she ran from was less than a minute away. Even in the dark, it would have been possible to orient herself using the streetlights. Yet there were no signs of an attempt to crawl out. No drag marks, no deep footprints consistent with someone struggling against the mud. It was as if she had stopped moving before her body became too heavy for the ground to hold. Something or someone halted her. I remembered her voice during the call to emergency services. The fear in each word did not sound like someone fleeing confusion. It sounded like someone fleeing a threat that remained close. The natural instinct in that situation is to move toward people, not away from them. Toward light, not darkness. Toward shelter, not marshland. But she did the opposite, which raised the single most important question I had encountered so far. What or who was she trying to escape? I imagined a figure behind her, just distant enough to stay out of sight, but close enough to keep her moving. Someone who understood where she was going. Someone who knew the marsh could silence a person faster than any weapon. Someone who had enough presence in the community to trust that no one would intervene. When search teams first entered this area, they described the silence as overwhelming. Even the wind felt muted, as if the marsh refused to reveal what had happened within it. Some investigators said they felt watched, not by animals, but by the weight of the case itself. The sensation was not unfamiliar. Places touched by violence often hold an echo of the moment it occurred. Time becomes strange. Gravity feels different. The environment remembers even when people try to forget. I ran my gloved hand across the reeds and felt the brittle texture. I thought of how long her remains had lain here. Days turning into weeks and weeks turning into months while the world moved on and the marsh kept what it had stolen. At some point, rescuers and officers stood in this exact spot, without knowing they were inches from the truth. The thought chilled me. It meant someone may have placed her here with confidence that she would not be found quickly. I stood up and looked toward the thin line of the highway in the distance. Cars passed, but their sound never reached this deep. I understood then that the person who left her here, whether by design or consequence, had relied on this isolation. The marsh was not only a hiding place, it was a message. A way of saying that the truth belonged to the water and the mud now, and it would take a great effort to pull it free. But every case has a moment where the environment begins to give up its secrets. The marsh was no exception. There were patterns of debris that hinted at directionality. There were distances between objects that contradicted natural scattering. There were inconsistencies in the documented timeline that suggested a window in which someone had opportunity. As I took one last look at the site before leaving, I felt a shift. The marsh no longer seemed silent. It seemed like it was whispering something. Not the full truth, not yet, but a suggestion that the real story began here. Not with Shannan's disappearance, but with whatever or whoever pushed her into the darkness. That was the moment I realized the marsh was not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of everything that still needed to be uncovered. Every investigation reaches a point where the facts stop behaving like facts. They drift, they contradict, they circle back on themselves. In the case of Shannan Gilbert, that moment arrived when I began tracing the connections between her disappearance and the larger mystery that had shaped Long Island for more than a decade. The mystery of the Long Island serial killer. Some investigators refused to see the connection, while others insisted that her case was the spark that illuminated the hidden darkness along Ocean Parkway. For me, the truth always lived somewhere between extremes, which meant I had to pull every thread until the invisible became visible. I spread the files across my desk and stepped back. On one side was Shannan's timeline. On the other were the victims found near Ocean Parkway. Women whose names had been whispered in police stations for years. Women abandoned in burlap sacks or placed carefully along the highway as if someone were constructing a pattern he believed no one would decipher. Some of them were Craigslist escorts. Some were missing for years before they were discovered. But they all shared one thing. Each one vanished into silence until the highway itself gave them back. There was something uncomfortable about placing Shannan alongside those victims because the police insisted she was not part of that group. Yet her disappearance was the reason the remains were found. Her panic was the reason search teams combed the shoreline. Her voice on that 22-minute call was the reason we even knew where to look. It was nearly impossible for me to believe her tragedy existed outside the orbit of that killer. I reviewed the evidence again. The similarities were undeniable. Victims who worked in the same field. Victims who met clients privately. Victims who vanished in quiet locations. And yet Shannan's case deviated in ways that did not fit the pattern. She was not wrapped in burlap like the others. She was not left directly along the highway. Her remains were not posed but scattered. She was not silenced instantaneously. She ran, she pleaded, and she fought. A killer who maintained strict control over his victims would not allow chaos. Chaos creates witnesses. Chaos creates noise. Chaos creates mistakes. This led me to a thought that I hesitated to write down because it carried implications no detective wants to confront. What if Shannan had encountered the killer before he had the chance to apply his signature? What if she had escaped him only to die in a frenzy of fear before he could finish what he intended? Or what if her death was not connected to him at all, but someone else in Oak Beach knew what she had seen or heard and acted to remove her before she exposed something larger? I considered her last interactions again. Joseph Brewer insisted nothing unusual happened inside his house, but his nervousness during interviews always felt disproportionate. Michael Pack appeared defensive and strangely irritated when discussing why she ran from him, and the ever-present figure of Charles Hackett hovered above the entire investigation like a cloud that refused to drift away. Each man offered a version of events that placed the responsibility elsewhere. Each one minimized his involvement to the point where the narrative became hollow. There is a principle in behavioral investigation that says, when multiple unrelated stories all seem designed to avoid blame, they often lead back to a shared truth. I began to feel that Oak Beach itself was complicit in hiding something. Whether it was fear, loyalty, or guilt, the residents had closed ranks. They spoke cautiously, they remembered selectively, they protected certain people by omission and others by silence. During one interview, a resident inadvertently revealed something that had never been documented. He mentioned seeing a flashlight beam moving behind the houses after Shannan had already vanished into the marsh. He assumed it was a neighbor. The detail struck me because search teams did not arrive until much later. If someone was behind the homes that early, it meant the sequence of events was more complex than the official timeline suggested. I asked him who he thought the person was. He swallowed deeply before answering. It might have been Dr. Hackett, he said. Or someone who looked like him. He was not sure, but the hesitation in his voice revealed more than the words he chose. The possibility scared him. People in Oak Beach rarely spoke the doctor's name without careful consideration. I returned to my office and stared at the evidence board. Some cases form a picture quickly, others take shape slowly like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Shannan's death was emerging in that second way. Faint outlines, shapes that almost made sense and then blurred again. But one thing remained constant. She had not wandered into danger by accident. Something had driven her to flee. Something had kept her from returning. Something had waited for the silence to settle before stepping back into the safe anonymity of Oak Beach. That something might have been a person acting alone, or a person connected to a larger pattern of violence. Either way, the invisible threads between Shannan and the LISK victims had begun to vibrate. I could not ignore them any longer. Profilers from the FBI had long suspected that the killer was someone familiar with the area, someone who understood isolation, someone who could move unnoticed between the suburbs and the highway, someone with confidence, someone who did not operate impulsively. If that person lived anywhere near Oak Beach, then Shannan's frantic escape may have intersected with him in a moment neither expected. Whether through coincidence or fate, she crossed into a landscape already haunted by a predator. I imagined the killer watching from a distance. I imagined him seeing her run. I imagined him weighing whether she was a threat or an opportunity. Serial predators behave according to internal calculations, and those calculations can shift when variables change. Perhaps that night Shannan became a variable he could not control. Perhaps he wanted her silenced because she had seen something. Or perhaps someone else silenced her for reasons that had nothing to do with him, but everything to do with the secrets the community had learned to bury. There was one final possibility that chilled me most of all. What if there were two predators at play? What if the darkness along Ocean Parkway belonged not to one man but to overlapping shadows? The truth was becoming more elusive the deeper I searched. But I felt myself getting closer, not to answers but to the gravitational pull of the real story. A story waiting to surface just beneath the mud of the marsh and the silence of the community. I closed the file and whispered one promise to the empty room. I will pull every thread until the invisible has no choice but to reveal itself. There comes a stage in every investigation when the case begins to speak back, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes in a roar. In the disappearance of Shannan Gilbert, the voice that came back to me was neither. It was something quieter than a whisper and heavier than a scream. It was the echo of a truth that refused to die even when the world decided to move on. I spent weeks reviewing every detail of the timeline. The phone records, the testimony of residents in Oak Beach who spoke as though their memories were made of smoke, the shifting stories of Joseph Brewer, the caution and calculation hidden in the words of Michael Park, and always the lingering presence of Charles Hackett, whose shadow seemed to lengthen each time I tried to narrow the scope of the investigation. The truth is not always a revelation. Sometimes the truth is a recognition that the answers you are looking for will not arrive as confessions or last-minute discoveries. They will arrive instead in the form of contradictions that refuse to disappear. Every contradiction points to a gap. Every gap points to a hidden action. And every hidden action points to someone who does not want the truth known. The more I followed the contradictions, the more the case began to split into two separate frontiers. One frontier belonged to the Long Island serial killer. The other belonged to the people who interacted with Shannan in the final hours of her life. Two worlds running parallel until the night she vanished when their paths may or may not have crossed. I revisited the call again. 22 minutes of terror, her voice shifting between fear and pleading. She said they were trying to kill her. The plural mattered. It always did. She did not say he. She did not say a man. She said they, which meant she perceived more than one threat. Whether those threats were physical or psychological did not matter. Her body reacted as if the danger was real. The thought haunted me. If there were multiple threats that night, then the scope of the investigation had always been too narrow. When I returned to the marsh one last time, I stood exactly where her remains were found. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but dense like sound pressed into the air. The reeds swayed, and for a brief moment I imagined her running through them once more. I imagined the fear in her lungs. I imagined her voice cracking as she begged the dispatcher to stay with her. I imagined the moment her path stopped, the moment something overtook her, or the moment her body finally surrendered to the terror that had chased her. I do not believe she died because she was disoriented. I do not believe she wandered blindly into nature's trap. She ran toward the marsh because something behind her was worse. The marsh was not a mistake. It was a choice born from desperation. I turned my attention back to Oak Beach. The community had resumed its quiet rhythms after her disappearance, almost too easily. Doors stayed shut. Neighbors continued their routines. The same houses stood aligned along the water with their windows facing outward like they were guarding a secret instead of overlooking the ocean. Some residents had grown irritated that the investigation had lasted so long. They wanted closure. They wanted normalcy. But closure is a privilege of the uninvolved. For those who carry the weight of unanswered questions, the business of returning to normal is a foreign language. I met with Shannan's family during the later stages of the investigation. Their grief was different from others I had seen. It was sharpened by confusion and dulled by exhaustion. They believed someone in Oak Beach knew more than they had admitted. They believed Shannan's death was not an accident. They believed the truth had been swallowed by people who hoped time would dull the edges of their responsibility. As I listened, I felt something I rarely allow in my work. I felt anger, not at the difficulty of the investigation, but at the indifference that surrounded it. Her final cries for help were met with hesitation. Her disappearance was met with silence. Her recovery was met with explanations designed to close doors rather than open them. It was then that I realized the real story was not only about who or what killed her. The real story was about how many people allowed the night to consume her without stepping forward. I reviewed the official findings once more and weighed them against what I had seen. The fractured jaw, the inconsistent testimonies, the unnatural dispersion of evidence, the unaccounted window of time, the flashlight moving behind the houses before police arrived. None of these details fit the neat narrative of accidental death. There are cases where the truth cannot be proven yet cannot be denied. Shannan's case lived in that space, a space between possibility and certainty, a space where the facts point toward human actions while the official record insists on nature's indifference. In that contradiction lies the answer. As investigators, we are trained to seek conclusions, but some cases are not puzzles that can be solved. They are warnings. They are mirrors held up to the systems that failed the victim. They are echoes of voices that tried to survive but were abandoned by the people who could have saved them. Shannan's voice remains one of those echoes. Her 22-minute call is not just evidence. It is testimony. It is the record of a woman who understood she was in danger and fought until the last breath allowed her to fight. Long after her body was found, her voice continued to haunt the investigation. It guided my steps through Oak Beach. It guided my steps through the marsh. It guided my steps through every interview and every contradiction. When I closed the file for the final time, I understood something that changed the way I viewed the case entirely. The investigation was not about proving whether the Long Island serial killer had taken her. It was not about choosing between suspects who contradicted one another. It was about understanding that something in Oak Beach had gone terribly wrong, and that the silence which followed was not natural but manufactured. Shannan may not have been a victim of the serial killer whose shadow hangs over Long Island, but she was certainly a victim of a community that chose self-preservation over humanity. And so I speak her story again. Not because repeating it will bring justice, but because silence is the thing that failed her. Silence is the thing that allowed the night to win. Somewhere between the highway and the marsh, the truth still breathes. It waits for someone willing to walk back into the dark. And if that is what it takes, I will go back into the dark again and again. Because echoes do not die, not when someone listens.